If there's no
Likewise,
Canadian participation by the deadline today, is it still beneficial for both the U.S. and Mexico to move ahead with their own bilateral deal?
Well, I think it's only ultimately a better agreement if you have a trilateral agreement. What the U.S. and Mexico did earlier this week is announce essentially a preliminary agreement in principle. And I think that was an effort to narrow the issues, particularly those that had been most contested in the context of U.S. and Mexico, the rules of origin, the sunset clause, things like this that had clouded the U.S.-Mexico negotiation, and then pivot towards the Canadian issues. As your previous speaker alluded to, you have the Chapter 19 on the anti-dumping and countervailing mechanism, how to contest those. And you also have those dairy issues. So while there's a fair amount of urgency, obviously, you alluded to the clock ticking, if there is an agreement of sorts, a solid handshake today, it still allows for 30 days, at which point the final text has to be submitted, and then we're off to the races in terms of the politics of Canada, of Mexico, and of the United States. So even if you get to that handshake today, the political obstacle course is still a very challenging one.
Mr. Ambassador, everyone knows that these trade agreements are not just about economies, but also about politics. The U.S. and Mexico deal that they announced early this week, was that a step forward, or did it do more to undermine, say, regional trust and cooperation between the three countries?
Well, I think that's still TBD. Obviously, in Ottawa, they can't be terribly happy, or on Monday afternoon, Tuesday, they weren't terribly happy that the U.S. and Mexico had announced an agreement. The expression that is often used is that Canada got thrown under the bus. I don't think that's actually the case. I think a bus has gone by pretty quickly, and Canada was asked to jump on it. The headwinds or the cautionary notes have really come from U.S. business interests, from Congress, and people that have looked at this agreement, analyzed, and said, you know, you really can't have a net better agreement without it being trilateral. That really this is about a platform in North America. And to try to approach it with a series of bilaterals or you know, an overlay of TPP would be extraordinarily complex, very cumbersome, and not give us the efficiencies and ability to create jobs and growth in all three economies that a trilateral agreement would give us. So, yeah, there's more to it than just the economies. I think the trust is very important in a negotiation. I think there's been some of that squandered. The costs associated with getting to this better agreement have been steep, but I'm hopeful that once we have an agreement, we can get back to doing business together and competing very effectively with the rest of the world.
At least when it comes to the U.S.-Mexico agreement earlier this week, the labor movement here in the U.S. seems to like it. I just spoke to Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO, and this is what he had to say. Take a listen.
This has everything to do with economics and workers' jobs and our livelihood. We want an agreement that no matter who is in the White House, we can enforce it to protect workers and have fair trade on both sides of the border. That's what we're striving for.
Mr. Trumka seems to like the fact that we're going to get higher wages from the Mexican side, which is going to discourage U.S. companies from shifting their production. Do you expect that to be the case?
Well, that's hard to say. If you look at the rules of origin, they've increased the regional content. That would mean from either of the three countries from 62.5 to 75%. That's the discussion. And that 40 to 45% of that content has to come from jobs paying $16 or more. What's not clear is it's from jobs. It can be U.S. jobs or Canadian jobs. Very unlikely to have a Mexican job paying $16 or greater. So it's still unclear as to the complexity of it, whether this is essentially another layer of regulation, and how you're going to affect compliance. So, while I can appreciate what Mr. Trumka has said, I'm not so sure that that's actually the case. And let's not forget that U.S. automobiles are also made for export. So ultimately, these increases in cost to produce are going to be borne by consumers, and may make the 20% of automobiles that are exported less competitive. So I think there's still some question marks around the ultimate impact of those rules of origin.
There are also questions on what's going to happen to the metals tariffs being imposed on Mexico and Canada. And on top of that, the U.S. threatening auto tariffs on Canada if there's no agreement there. How troublesome is this?
Well, I think that those 232 issues need to be resolved. If we're truly looking at moving towards a trade environment that allows for competitiveness, that's best for consumers, that creates jobs, that's got to be addressed. And there's some discussion that moving away from the tariffs and perhaps to some quota type framework is a direction this will ultimately go. But I agree that you can't really be talking trade with a real vision about trade unless you're addressing those tariffs on steel and aluminum.
And talking about Mexico, how important is it for the Mexican side to get an agreement on their deal with the United States, even if it doesn't include Canada, before López Obrador takes office on December 1st?
Well, one of the most impressive things, I think, in this transition period from the current administration to the President-elect López Obrador has been the complete alignment of interest between the current administration and the successor. And I think that's in large part because President-elect López Obrador would like to have an agreement behind him. His campaign and his agenda has been largely domestic, focused on corruption and security in Mexico. And I don't think the first thing he wants to be dealing with as president come December 1st is going to be a Nafta issue that was left pending. So I think they'd all like to see it get done here so that he can then focus on his domestic agenda.